University, and today we're talking about the Transatlantic Alliance at the tipping point. I hope that's what you came for. If you didn't, it'll be more exciting than what you thought you were going to have. So we've got a fabulous panel this afternoon to discuss these issues. On my right, Jeanine Hennis-Plasschaert, who is Minister of Defence in the Netherlands. We've got Admiral Jim Stavridis, who's now Dean of the Fletcher School. That's right, isn't it? Dean, fellow Dean. We have Ursula von der Leyen, who is Minister of Defence in Germany. And we have Frederick Kempe, who's President of the Atlantic Council. So plenty of wisdom on this little stage, but I look out into a room and see a whole lot more wisdom. So I'm going to invite you to make this a conversation today and to engage with us. But let's start with the moment that we're at. This feels like a pretty historic moment at Davos. The theatre of it has been extraordinary. President Xi Jinping has literally strode onto the international stage and said, we're ready for global leadership. And the United States seems almost absent, or at least it feels as though they've crossed the Atlantic. But you could say cooperation across the whole world over the last 50 years. Fred Kempe, is that what it feels like to you? Has the United States pushed the pause button on international cooperation? Is it now willing to sort of retire gracefully and let China step in and be global hegemon?
In a word, no. It doesn't feel that way at all to me. Don't over-exaggerate the week of inauguration. And there is no doubt this president is a different sort of president. He is the first populist president the United States has elected since Andrew Jackson. So he will communicate differently, and he will act differently. But if you look at the national security team that's coming in and that went through its confirmation hearings last week, it's pretty conventional stuff, and they're brilliant, and they're very good. General Mattis is a person who was the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation at NATO. He believes in NATO. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State elect or to be confirmed, really made a very compelling call for renewed U.S. engagement. In other words, engagement in a deeper form than you've seen in the Obama administration, with more assertiveness. And he said, if we don't do this, the world's going to continue to go into confusion and danger. So what I would say about Xi Jinping, what's welcome about this is he's really signing on to the international order that the West created at the end of World War II to end war, to create norms, rules, and procedures that the global community could do together. And there's been a big question about whether we can sustain, adjust, reinvigorate, remake that order. So it won't be US-led in the way it was before, but to have China on as enthusiastically as it is a positive thing. We can talk more about the Trump administration later. I don't want to take too much time right now, but I would just caution people to not sound the death knell of the Transatlantic Alliance quite so soon.
Right, but it takes two to tango, and I think Europeans are trying to read the tea leaves. The President-elect's spokesperson said we shouldn't listen to what the President-elect says. We should look at what's in his heart, which, well, I'm limited. I find that difficult. I'm not a heart surgeon. I'm not sure how we do that. But Ursula von der Leyen, what does it feel like from a European point of view? Is this the moment for Europe to step boldly forward, and why hasn't it?
It is the moment for Europe to step forward, but it's not the starting point. We started already knowing that our alliance is based on two sides of a coin. The one side is there's a long-lasting experience of friendship and trust, almost 70 years in this alliance. There is a humongous experience there that is very precious to us, how to work together and how to improve the world. But the third point is the most important on the one side of the coin, and this is the values we share. We are fighting for something. We're not fighting against something. We're fighting for something. We're fighting for democracy. We're fighting for the open society, for the rule of law, for human rights. This is what unites us in the Transatlantic Alliance. And this is what helps us to get over differences that are always there if 28 different countries are working together. There's another side of the coin that is much more practical. This is the investment. And I'm absolutely with you, and I know Jeanine and me, we've been talking about that since quite a while, that Europe has to take a fair share of the burden. It's not at the point right now. So we have to invest more in defense. We had in Germany already a turnaround in the budget. We have a rising budget. It's rising steeper than the overall budget in Germany has been rising. We invest way more. We enlarge our military forces. We have rising personnel, numbers of personnel, all these factors. So this part is clear. And what we are working on as Europeans is we want a strong European pillar within NATO. Europe has to be mature. Europe has to figure out what is our own way to tackle problems that are mainly European problems. An example is how are we dealing with Africa, for example. For that, you need a strong European defense union, because I do not see NATO in Africa, but I see Europe strongly working together with Africa to solve topics of migration and development and stability in Africa as an example. So, in short, I'm very confident that this wonderful and precious friendship will last long. We know where we do come from. This friendship has been built up after World War II, and this is something we still carry in our hearts. We know why we're standing together.
But can I pick you up on your core message, which is this is about protecting values, open society, democracy, etc. Because doesn't the threat to that come from within European countries? It's the movements within Germany, within France, that are calling for something else and for something different. It's a new populism inside each country. Why do we need international cooperation to protect democracy within our own borders?
Well, now we're talking about the rise of populist movements. And this is not only a NATO problem, this is a wider problem of highly industrialized countries mainly, of stable democracies. And I see two topics that led to this movement or started this movement. The largest one is that globalization does happen. But it triggered also the financial and economic crisis, and the way it has been handled globally and the way it has been overcome globally ended up with, in some countries, not in all countries, but in some countries, with a sharp divide between those who have less and those who have more. So the bill has been paid by middle class or lower economic income. And a lot of people went out of this economic crisis with a lot of more wealth. So it's a question of fairness, it's a question of social inclusion that people do not want anymore.
But why is NATO relevant to that?
NATO is relevant to that because we have within NATO, it is founded, of course, to defend our territory. It's Article 5. An example, once in NATO's times, Article 5 has been pulled. It was because the United States of America have been attacked in 9/11. And we all stood at America's side. We always will do that. So this is a very valuable experience. But this is not only a military alliance, but we are fighting for the same values. This does not mean that within the countries themselves we have to stand up for democracy. We have to stand up for an open society. As in Germany, we have a very robust economy. We have the lowest unemployment since reunification. We have the highest amount of people in work since ever in our history. Rising wages, rising pensions, stable prices. So it's not an economic question in Germany, but we also have this tendency of populism with the experience of globalization through migration. And the fear, what does it cause? What does this mean for my country? We have to work on that, no question. But I also think this is a time for people who want an open society to stand up and to tell our own narrative and to argue why it is valuable to defend that.
Right, and I think we've seen the cross-border effects of populist movements in one country spreading to another, including, of course, where governments pay bloggers to do that. But you're saying that now, as it were, the Open Society Democrats need to do the same. They need to become more infectious across each other's borders in a way.
Well, globalization means the values I was talking about. There are three trends who are attacking this open society. One is Daesh as a name for terror, who tries to force our societies to close up. The second is the trends I was just talking about, the effects of globalization and the uncertainty and the fear of people that the future will not be better, but worse, and therefore the retreat on nationalism. And the third one, you just tipped on it, is manipulation of public opinion through bots and trolls and fake news. This is another topic, but I was just outlining the three main threats. So once again, the global community of open societies has to stand up.
Admiral Stavridis, you've seen this from a military perspective. Now, you've had your conversations with the president-elect and so forth. But I'd like to pick up what's at stake here. Like, what is it that the Transatlantic Alliance now needs to do? We can look back with, great and positive reminiscences about how it's helped construct cooperation in the world since the Second World War. But when I look forward, this example, both Russia and China, it's a known fact, pay a lot of their citizens to blog, social media, etc. It's become, in other words, part of the armory of geostrategic competition. So is that a call for the Transatlantic Alliance to up its game, to innovate? Should they be doing the same? Should they be doing it together? What do you think? How do we move this Transatlantic Alliance forward? And is that what President Trump is calling for?
Well, I'd begin by recalling the title of our panel, which is the Alliance at a tipping point? And I think it's more a slipping point. We're kind of slipping down a little bit. In other words, a tipping point would imply that we're on the verge of some kind of catastrophic fall off the cliff kind of thing, and we're not. But we are kind of slipping, and we're slipping in a couple of dimensions. Before I elucidate that, let me just kind of do the numbers for a minute to Fred's point about don't count out the Transatlantic Alliance quite yet. So the U.S. spends $600 billion a year on defense. Our European colleagues spend $300 billion a year on defense. That's $900 billion in defense spending across the Atlantic. The Chinese, by comparison, spend only $150 billion, and the Russians only $80 billion. So our European partners spend more than China and Russia combined. This is a return on investment point that I tried to make with the president-elect when I spoke with him for about an hour 3 or 4 weeks ago. Secondly, military capability in NATO is just enormous. We have 3 million soldiers, sailors, airmen under arms, men and women, almost all of them volunteers, 4 million in the reserves, 24,000 combat aircraft, 50 AWACS, 800 ocean-going ships. This is an extraordinary alliance. That's the good news. Where we're slipping is, to the minister's point, our confidence is slipping. We are not expressing our values effectively. We're not facing challenges. So to conclude, 3 things the alliance should do to answer your fundamental question. One is we need to up our game significantly in cyber. I think we can all see the effect of that from attacks going back and forth across borders. Secondly, we need to do a much better job in what you mentioned, Ngaire, which is strategic communications, again, to the minister's point. We need to articulate these values, which actually didn't come since the end of the Second World War, if I may. They really came from the Enlightenment in Europe in the mid-1700s, and frankly, you can drop a plumb line from the ancient Greeks. I'm required to say that because I'm Greek-American. So we need to up our game in strategic communications. And then third and finally, we could do a better job of partnering and building partnerships outside the core NATO countries. We do a reasonable job of that today with Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, where we are today, Australia, but we ought to be expanding that. Colombia, Japan, South Korea, not bringing them into the NATO alliance, but because they share our values, they need to be part of this global coalition.
But can I come back to your first point?
Sure.
We've got huge capacity in the Transatlantic Alliance. All of everything you said, huge military spending, soldiers, armaments,
Yeah.
whatever. What should we use them to defend ourselves from? What for you are the top 2 or 3 threats that we need this big armory to defend ourselves from?
Sure. I actually would put cyber at the top of the list because it's become an enormous equalizer where a nation like North Korea can attack an American corporation and do tens of millions of dollars of kinetic damage, where big nations like Russia can use that cyber muscle in a variety of ways. China's very effective here as well. I think cyber would be one area. A second big challenge is the one the minister mentioned, and I'll call it violent extremism. Part of it stems from radicalization within Islam. Part of it is political extremism, Anders Breivik in Norway. Part of it is racial extremism, as in Dylan Roof in the United States. So I think that kind of violent extremism is a second big issue. And then thirdly, kind of the third rail in this whole conversation is, if you will, the return of great power politics as we see the alliance kind of slipping from a preeminent position. We have to work with China. We have to work with Russia. We're going to see new actors rising. Here I would point to India. We don't talk enough about India and its role as a rising power in the 21st century. Germany is being much more robust in the world. Japan, I think, will have a more defined and articulate role. So we're headed for a complicated, multipolar world, and that requires deterrent capability to ensure we don't see conflict flare up.
Thank you.
May I add
Sure.
briefly? First of all, Admiral Stavridis should be saluted for the job he did as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, so he knows what he's talking about, and that's the reason this answer is about as good an answer as you get. I would add one thing to it: U.S. leadership. The alliance has only ever been as good as how committed the U.S. is to it. And the reason there are questions right now isn't necessarily that Donald Trump has said it's obsolete, because that could actually be helpful. What we are hearing from the transition figures is they want more burden sharing, which the minister said she's willing to do, and they want more help with ISIS, which is in European interests. So he could get some wins this year where suddenly you have President Trump celebrating his leadership of the alliance with other allies. I would think that's a more likely than unlikely outcome. But we don't know what his governing philosophy is. We don't know what his national security strategy is. We don't know whether he's going to think in these terms, and he has to. You asked in the beginning, is it a historic moment? It's a historic moment as important as the end of World War I, the end of World War II, maybe go back to 1815. And this is a president, for better or worse, depending on how you feel about him, who is going to lead us at a time when he has to decide how the U.S. wants to interact with the international order that it created with its allies. And that's really what we're facing.
So, but let me come to Jeanine Hennis-Plasschaert, because this is, you might say, an American view, that the Transatlantic Alliance depends on U.S. leadership. Isn't it time for the European Union to step up and lead on this Transatlantic Alliance, if it's got these huge capabilities?
It is time for the European Union to stand up and to get its act together, but I would also underline, or more or less stress, that the world continues to need US leadership, or at least an outward-looking and vibrant United States. And I'm also convinced that the world continues to need a strong transatlantic alliance with Europe and the United States, exactly because what has been said by Ursula von der Leyen about our joint commitment to human rights, democracy, freedom, the rule of law, etc., etc. So we all know that geopolitical tension and conflicts will stay with us for a while, and that we will have to show some unity to counter them and to stem the tide of refugees, to tackle the hybrid threat. So there are many reasons for us, for Europe and the United States, to act in unity. Well, I mean, the president-elect is not the first American to tell the Europeans to get their act together and to take their fair share of the burden in financially, but also in taking the risks. Obama said so, and many others, and they are right. It is high time to position Europe as a credible, convincing, and reliable security provider.
And who's the European leader that we can all associate with that leadership position?
Well, the two of no.
No, but if, I think we'll all like it. No, because that is part, it's easy. We all know the name of the American president, but, who is the leader, the one-stop shop in Europe that we can turn to and say, right, here's the person that we can build this Transatlantic Alliance?
You're absolutely right. I mean, clearly we have the so-called High Representative, Mrs. Federica Mogherini. She's doing a great job. At the very end, it's up to the member states to act once again in unity. It's all about political will. You and I, we discussed a lot about it. I mean, I have to be honest. Within Europe, we made a lot of progress on a stronger position of Europe as a convincing security provider, not only in its immediate region, but also beyond. At the same time, we also face some severe setback. I mean, the prospect of the UK departure is obviously not helping us. But if the Brexit dust will settle a bit more, then I am convinced that with countries like Germany and the Netherlands, that we will be able to further enhance our common security and defense policy and to position Europe as a more reliable partner within the Transatlantic Alliance.
Mm-hmm. Mary, could I just add a thought, which is, I don't know that the minister would want to do this, but as an outsider, I would say the answer to the question is Angela Merkel. Mm-hmm. She has the experience. She's been in the position, 12 years? She has real leadership skills. You see it. I've seen her many, many times in international gatherings. I think she enjoys global respect. And she is a very capable, tough-minded person. And I think to the degree, looking at it from our side of the Atlantic, above all, again to the minister's point, she represents values. She makes value-based decisions from everything I can see.
But Admiral Stavridis, can I just, I'm going to come to you in a second on this same question. Sorry, but if, I think some people in the audience are sitting there saying, well, so what if NATO collapses? So tell us, Admiral Stavridis, so what? What would it mean for the people in this room if NATO collapses?
I don't know about in this room, but there'd be a lot of vodka drunk in the Kremlin that night. It would be a break, a fundamental break in the international system, Ngaire, and it would represent a diminution of the value set, A. B, it would be a geostrategic mistake for both sides of the Atlantic. Thirdly, it would diminish our ability to operate together collectively in cyberspace, in strategic communication, in missions like Afghanistan, which continue today, in the Balkans. So I think there's real pragmatic effect there, but above all, it would shatter the collective European context because of the lack of that partner to the West. But I would ask the Europeans on the panel to ask.
Germany?
We have been a divided country for a very long time, and we have been at the eastern border, and we know how that feeling is if you're not being protected by others to counter an aggression from the other side of the border. Now we're in the middle, in the heart of Europe, but we have not forgotten how it feels for example, the Baltic states. To be there, they have fought long and heavily to join the European Union and to be free and independent and sovereign countries. They have doing enormous reforms to have now the economic strength they do have, but they know what it means to be at the border. And what the alliance does is the alliance puts in a military strength that says to the neighbor, don't even think about trying to attack any kind in whatever form of the Baltic states, just as an example, because you're going to have 28 against you. And the second message is, so it's way better to sit down at the negotiation table and talk about the problems we have and how we can solve it. This is the double message a strong NATO always sends. And therefore NATO is, the stronger NATO is, the higher the probability we will solve problems in a peaceful way on a negotiation table. And we should be crazy to to end this enormous value and asset we do have. And the second thing, I'm because of Europe. Who am I to talk against what has been said about Germany here in the room? But still, I would like to recall, yes, we have to take on leadership. We always call it from the center. But Europe is a phenomenon of 28 countries, actually who have 24 languages, 19 single money. There has been since World War II peace between those 28 countries and enormous economic wealth. And we function, yes, perhaps slowly, but it goes in a way that everybody is listened to and can put in his or her opinion as a country. This is something very valuable because it's the core of democracies, that there is not one king, monarch who says, or authoritarian dictator who says that's the way we're going, but we discuss what is the best way to move forward. That is slow, I know, and that's sometimes frustrating. But the positive part in it is, it shapes the best way to move forward, and that's what the strength of Europe is. What defense is concerned, out of historical reasons, for a very, very long time, nobody wanted Europe to have a strong European defense union. Mainly the United States didn't want to have a united Europe within NATO. This has changed 180 degrees. Since then, we say, so let's put our forces together. An example with the Netherlands is we have our Navy in a way that the Netherlands built a huge joint support ship. We supply the personnel, so we have a capability none of us would have on its own, but it's possible in a European Union.
Great. Now, I'm just going to bring in all the other participants in this debate, including those behind me, to say, well, let's start just by asking you two questions. So one, how many of you think the Transatlantic Alliance is going to get weaker over the next 5 years? So how many think it's going to weaken? Okay. So a minority. Okay. How many of you think it's going to strengthen? Okay. And how many of you think it's going to stay the same? Now, there's a lot of people in this room that are clearly not thinking at all. I saw some hands not going up.
How many say it's up for grabs? I mean, that's the point. That's the point. We don't know.
So maybe you were thinking, but you were thinking it was up for grabs. Okay. So let me move to a second question, which is, how many of you share the view that that an ongoing strong transatlantic alliance is going to be crucial for your security? How many of you think that? Okay. So that's almost everybody in the room, and yet a relatively small number of you thought that it was going to get stronger. So what are the questions you want to put to these panelists?
But can I add something? Because obviously, I mean, we're living in a multi-layered world order, and we have we are criticizing our multinational organizations, and I understand. Could you imagine a world without NATO, without the UN, without the European Union? I mean, it would be very complex and difficult to govern this world order. Now, obviously, it's good to criticize multinational institutions, but we also have to realize that they're as strong as the states, the members of this institution. That goes for the UN, that goes for NATO. And many of us are right now, in a way, dealing with, a narrow-minded nationalism, all kinds of crises, and that's also undermining the effectiveness, in my view, of the multinational organizations. So I believe that if we empower the states or the institutions the coming years, that will be possible, but it also depends on the health and the well-being in the member states.
Right, but let's take, Admiral Stavridis has given us 3 big threats to think about.
Yeah.
Cyber. But you've said that actually the Transatlantic Alliance isn't doing well on cyber.
Nope. Oh, that's not true.
Well,
good. Come on, tell us.
I think individually,
why is it not true?
Individually, the nations are pursuing a great deal of cyber work, and Germany's quite capable in this zone. Many of the Europeans are. The United States certainly is. We're not, in my view, collectively bringing that together because these protocols, these particular codes, these tools are so precious and so guarded. I think we need to give up a little bit of our clearance process and do more collectively in this area. I just don't think we're well prepared.
Does that ring true?
Yeah, this is way more differentiated. This
Yeah.
is fine. I'm fine with that.
Okay, Fred?
Let me underscore, I mean, if you're
at the
looking 10 to 20 years out, there are 3 mega threats facing us. One of them is the return of the danger of major power conflict. That was unthinkable a few years ago. And I'll get to the point on NATO here because there is a really strong one. The second is a unraveling of Western democracies. And the third is the breakdown of the global order. All 3 of those things are possible over the next 10 or 20 years. If you know all those 3 things are possible, what do you do as a leader? You counteract them. You know that those trends are possible and you act against them. And so this is where if NATO starts unraveling, the rest of it can come undone as well. Also, if you want to ask yourself the difference between NATO being held there or not being there, look at the difference between Poland and Ukraine.
No, but it doesn't follow that if NATO starts unraveling, the whole world order comes apart. I mean, how
Well,
can
okay,
you...
here's where it comes apart. The biggest dangers, underneath those dangers, this year, 2017, is an unraveling of Europe. You've got a French election, you've got a Dutch election, you've got a German election. If all 3 of those go wrong, you're in a much different state in Europe, much different. Now, I doubt that all 3 will go wrong, but even if one of them goes wrong, you've got a very bad situation. Or disengagement of the United States, which I think we've been seeing. And the question is, do we counteract that, and does the U.S. take on its responsibility again? And so I really do think we're at, maybe it's a slipping point for NATO, but if you look at the international order, with a few wrong calls here and there, it could be a tipping point. And so I just think that we have to make clear that when you're talking about NATO, you're talking about one of the institutions formed after World War II out of the lessons that we learned after World War I. And the questions, are we going to unlearn those lessons and sort of sleepwalk into a disaster again?
The second big issue on your list was extremism.
Correct.
I'm intrigued that you think that all of these military means are a way to deal with that, because in Europe, certainly, the extremists are within society. And surely, well, speaking as a defense expert, what is the way, what should be the frontline defense against extremism?
Yeah, well, let's unpackage that a little bit. I did not say that the military tool was the only tool to deal with violent extremism. I would argue it's probably the last tool. The first one is education. The second is creating long-term opportunity. The third is strategic communication. These are all what might be termed soft power. The hard power instrument, occasionally you need. We're not going to negotiate or educate or provide opportunity to the hardcore center of the Islamic State. We're going to find them and kill them. So you need that hard power often at the end game, but the long game is on the soft power side. And when you bring those 2 together effectively, Ngaire, some have called that smart power, and I think that's a pretty effective
And why
approach.
aren't governments using that?
So,
Please.
there's
Ursula.
one thing, this is, I think, interesting for the development and the future of NATO. Because if you look at how to fight the cause or the origin of terror, which is often leading to failing states and then to migration movements, as we've seen, the European Union is pretty strong at that, because the so-called soft powers, which are very valuable and precious powers, like economic development, like implementing good governance, fighting corruption, bringing education, building perspectives for youth, are tools that the European Union has. And if we now add the tool which we are working on in the European Defence Union of a stronger defence sector, you have the set you need to tackle these problems. For example, for Europe, it means to deal with our neighbor Africa, how to stabilize and enable and fortify those countries against the terroristic threat. I think a good example where it works is at the moment being Iraq, because you should keep in mind 2.5 years ago, Daesh took Mosul, tried to commit a genocide with the Yazidis. And this was the moment where the coalition against terror went into the scene. Of course, we had, on a military basis, we had to fight Daesh because you cannot negotiate with Daesh. Today, Daesh, who was almost 10 kilometers from Baghdad, at the very best point of their offensive. Today, we are at the point, we are in the process of taking back Mosul on a military way, but the difference is, in this time in Iraq, that with every single city, like Ramadi or Tikrit, the moment we had taken it back with military means, actually with the local troops, the Kurds and the central Iraq government, the moment it was taken back, the UN went in with water, electricity, rebuilt the houses, reconciliation, to make sure that people realize there is a difference whether Daesh is dominating them or whether they are being freed. And this comprehensive approach, this is one thing that NATO tries now to enlarge in the prospect, because this is the way we have to deal with the countries themselves, with conflicts and sides.
I agree, but we're still at the beginning. I mean, clearly you're also referring to the fact that our internal security is completely interwoven with our external security. So I prefer to fight Daesh in Syria and Iraq than I fight them in our inner cities. Still, we do face up to some of the homegrown terrorists. It's unavoidable, unfortunately. Last week, I visited Fallujah. The Dutch and the United States and many others, we have been flying in 2014 our F-16s to fight Daesh. Now, Fallujah was liberated last summer. And to me, it was a complete shock because the city is totally damaged. People are coming back from the refugee camps from Turkey, trying to find their home, which is totally destroyed, and trying to rebuild their society, which is impossible because, there is no water, no electricity. I mean, schools are opening up, but very slowly. So, yes, Ursula is absolutely right that the comprehensive approach is the one that we should follow, but we are at the beginning of making it a success because it's way too slow. And now we have people in Fallujah that returned to Fallujah, but actually told me we want to go back to Turkey because the circumstances in the refugee camps were a lot better than we are now experiencing.
Can I pick up a big point that's coming out of this? Because all four of you are European or American. And you've brought up different parts of the Middle East. Now, there are some people, particularly in the region, which has suffered hundreds of thousands of deaths in the last decade, that would say that this is where NATO has really failed. It's been too quick to use military policy. It's been too slow to pick up and fix the things it's broken. And that it's almost too tempting when you've got a military alliance to use the hammer rather than to use other tools which you don't have cooperation for.
Well, let's look at 3 case studies. One would be Libya, which is your point. We pulled out the military tool, we used it, we walked away. We have reaped what we sowed, which is the result that one would expect by the lack of a comprehensive approach. At the other end of the spectrum, I would argue, is the Balkans. If we think back on the Balkans of 20 years ago, 8,000 men and boys killed over a few days in Srebrenica, 250,000 people killed, millions pushed across borders. Today, when they want to solve a problem, they don't reach for their rifles, they reach for a telephone to call Brussels to help us negotiate. We've used the comprehensive approach reasonably effectively in the Balkans. Not perfect, but much, much better. In the middle, I would argue, is Afghanistan, where the jury is still out. Let's see what happens in Afghanistan. But we have certainly tried very hard with the comprehensive approach there for 15 years. It's far from perfect. But if we stay, currently we have about 12,000 NATO troops there, I think the wheels stay on the car, probably 2 in 3 chance of that, Ngaire. Still a 1 in 3 chance it all goes very, very badly. But there's 3 case studies, and the degree to which we've invested and used the comprehensive approach, I think we can show pretty good results. And last thought, taking it away from NATO completely, look at Colombia, which for 50 years has been in a terrible insurgency, but But using what we would call the comprehensive approach, a mix of hard and soft power, they have managed to reach a point where they have negotiated a reasonable peace settlement, and I think they're going to move forward. So there are some examples of how this works successfully. There are counterexamples of failure. As always, the degree to which we succeed is the degree to which we are dedicated.
What do you think of that, Fred Kempe? I mean, if I were trying to bring up my children in Syria or Iraq, I would say that the global order that perhaps, we've all championed has served some people well, but it certainly hasn't served me well.
There's a temptation, certainly in the United States, to throw up our arms and say, look, we intervened and we didn't get it right in Iraq or in the Middle East, we made things worse. We've stepped away in Syria, and there are now maybe 500,000 dead. We certainly didn't help ourselves by not intervening there. What do? We took a hard look at this at the Atlantic Council with Steve Hadley, a Republican National Security Advisor, Madeleine Albright, a Democratic Secretary of State, and we've given a report to the incoming administration in saying we can't do it. It has to be done by the countries of the Middle East. They have to frame where they want to go for the future, and then they have to be partners with us because they can't do it alone, but we can't do it unless they take the lead. And it's a very comprehensive plan, but it involves governance. It involves religion and identity questions. It involves entrepreneurship and education and all of these things. It involves perhaps creating a NATO for the Middle East, perhaps creating, having even something like a Treaty of Westphalia or a Congress of Vienna type meeting. The fact is we can't sit back and just let it burn. There are 4 civil wars there. You can't just let people continue to die because it is no longer a crisis in the Middle East. It's a crisis from the Middle East that's unsettling Europe. It's unsettling us with migrants. It's unsettling us with extremism. So you can't walk away from it. So to me, this is one of the biggest assignments for us as a global community into the Trump administration and far behind. We just can't let this region burn the way we've been letting it burn for a while. But you're absolutely right. We have to do it much differently. And military cannot be the leading element, but it has to be an element.
So we've got there's quite a consensus in the room that we need a stronger transatlantic alliance, but that it also, these experts are telling us, it really needs to do better. It's got to do better on cyber. It's got to do better on defending the democratic systems that are at the core of it. It's got to do a whole lot better and differently in areas like the countries of the Middle East. If that's the case, what are the next steps towards it? So, Jeanine, let me start with you. Ursula mentioned at the core of it there needs to be stronger European defence cooperation.
Yes.
A European defence union.
Yes.
What's the obstacle to that? Why hasn't it happened?
Political will.
Okay, but tell us. People say political will, and
This is.
what are the 2 obstacles you need to get rid of to make it happen?
If you talk about a common defence security policy, that's all fine. As soon as you start to touch upon a single set of European armed forces, people get really nervous. And I don't think that we should speak about a single set of European armed forces. We do not have a single set of NATO armed forces, for example. So it's all about further integration like Germany and the Netherlands are doing as we speak. Still, there's immediately this debate about sovereignty. And I understand. I mean, sovereignty is a kind of a buzzword if you speak about military cooperation. Because if you integrate units, then you also say yes to, later on, to act together, to act jointly, for example, in Iraq, for example, in Syria, for example, in the Sahel region. So it's all about sovereignty and about, I'm sorry to say or to repeat it, the narrow-minded nationalism dictating most of our agendas at the moment. So people feel that if, for example, the Netherlands is just a small or medium-sized country, and I should say immediately with a great history, but we're just a small or medium-sized country, and there is no way that we would be able to defend ourselves, so we always need to do it in an alliance. But the same goes at the very same time for a bigger country like Germany. Still, people buy it, people understand, but as soon as you start to talk about further integration of military cooperation, and thus acting together, wherever in the world, people, or this huge debate, not necessarily in Germany or the Netherlands, but in many other EU member states, on sovereignty is immediately a reality, and that is in the way. So
But
it's
what's
all about
making
political
that,
will.
You know, you've just given us a very positive example of the
Yeah.
beginnings of it, the
Yeah.
defence cooperation between your two countries,
Yes.
right? That is working.
Yes.
Is it because they both have fabulous defence ministers,
Yes.
or like what's
Yes.
what's the secret to this?
No,
To complete the story. It was so difficult to get the act together during times where things are easy, because you know that mankind is lazy. So why change anything as long as everything is smooth? We've heard the wake-up calls of the last 2 years,
Yes.
without any question. And therefore, we have a common initiative now to establish structures for a European Defence Union. We're talking very concrete about civil-military combined planning entities. You know what that means. For us, yeah, we're talking about a structured cooperation of European 27 knowing that the Brexit will happen. So there are initiatives underway now that are pretty
But
concrete.
wouldn't that be easier if you did it with just a much smaller core of
No,
countries, like
because
2 or 3 or 4
this-
countries at the heart of Europe?
This is not good for Europe if you start to have small clubs within the large European
but
idea.
it's happening. It's
And-
happening
and-
already.
Well, but what I think is I would always work like put a frame around
Yeah.
it, like a structured cooperation between 27. Not everyone has to do everything. This is, of course, true. If the two of us work on a European medical command with others who want to join, perfect. On a European logistic hub, which we are building up now, is necessary. NATO would be happy if we had a European logistic hub, because it's necessary for all of us. You see, these are very concrete projects we're starting. Why are they starting now? Because pressure is high.
But
So
that
never
answers
waste
a
a good
wonderful
crisis.
example of Germany's leadership trying to keep the 27 together.
We
But,
couldn't do it with
Jeanine,
others.
Where else are we seeing? No, don't look at each other, because I want you to disagree.
I'm sorry, but the two of us, we
Where-
worked together for
where-
4
no,
years
but,
now.
But where else are we seeing cooperation in a smaller group emerging?
No, the thing is that I agree with Ursula on the fact that you need a common framework. At the very same time, I'm also making a plea for a pragmatic and bottom-up approach. Ursula knows all about it. Because, to use a British expression, if you want the 28 member states to act at the very same day or moment, then you can wait until the cows come home. It's not going to happen. So we have to be as pragmatic as possible, and that's why like-minded countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on, we can really give a boost to our military integration by truly integrating our military units and by acquiring military capabilities together. And as I said earlier, impressive progress has been made. We have a European Air Transport Command, for example. I mean, Belgium and the Netherlands, we have fully integrated navies. I mean, that's really something. We have our Air Mobile Brigade completely integrated in the Division Schnelle Kräfte. I can give you many examples, and all of these are examples to be proud of. At the very same time, as I said, if you want more member states to participate or to copy our model, then immediately you run into the discussion about sovereignty, and that really starts to bother me a bit. I have to, after 4 years in office and trying to understand and being diplomatic, I think it is about time again that Europe and that all 28 member states do realize, or maybe 27. That it's not just Germany and the Netherlands and a few others, but it's all 28 that have responsibility for the security of our citizens and for a rebalancing in the relationship with the United States and a stronger NATO.
Can I just ruin the party for a little minute? We're in a situation where, as Admiral Stavridis said, you have $300 billion defense budget for the non-U.S. NATO countries, and you have half of that with China. You don't get twice the capability of Europe that you have with China. Yeah. And that's the reason of the way things have been done. Terrific if uncertainties or new uncertainties are making Europe look at this harder. But I would argue one should go in a much different direction, which is strengthen NATO and make it global. and bring in global partners. That's where you get the capabilities.
No, but it's the
And if we-
partnering.
Okay,
Sorry,
but
and-
can we come back to the partners for a moment? Because
Yeah.
the Europeans on this panel have said, look, we Europeans need to get our act together. And you've been very honest and frank about that. So, Admiral Stavridis, how does the United States need to get its act together?
Well, I think first and foremost is the leadership role. I think we do have a tendency at the moment to be kind of leaning back from global engagement. We're going to know a lot more in 6 to 12 months as we see the new administration unfold. As Fred says, I'm encouraged by the team that President-elect Trump has put together. But first and foremost is U.S. engagement and leadership. Second is in cyber. We have the best set of cyber tools, the best capability to protect. We have reasonable offensive capability. I think that's something that we can share more and benefit from the good work of others. So I'd say cyber is the second place the U.S. could lead. Third is technology. Our defense industries are very, very good. So are those in Germany and the Netherlands and other partners. But I think there's private-public partnering that can do better, and that could be a NATO, that could be a U.S.-led kind of effort as well. And fourth and finally, as I mentioned earlier, the U.S., because of its global stance, I think is very well positioned to help bring more partners into play, because we are a Pacific power. We are an Indian Ocean power. We have global responsibilities. And in fact, to conclude, going back to spending, we tend to act as though the $600 billion that we spend is somehow so much more than the Europeans. But we ought to remember we're using $600 billion globally. Europeans are using $300 billion essentially in and around the European peninsula. So I think those are 4 areas the U.S. could share some leadership role in.
Fred, that's Admiral Stavridis gives us a vision of a United States that will continue to act kind of generously in bringing people on, bringing people in, accepting what some would call the costs of being hegemon. That's not the kind of let's do deals mentality. This could just be a difference in rhetoric, but the rhetoric actually matters. What's the one thing that if you had a magic wand, you would have the new American administration do in order to bring about the kind of global cooperation that you've spoken so eloquently about?
It's going to be an attitude, and it has to come from the Oval Office. And I think what you have to have is enough people going into the president-elect's and the president's office in a couple of days and say, to make America first, because I think he is going to follow up on that campaign promise, to make America great again, the way he's put it, you have to make global America great again. And it isn't a cost. It's something that we've had a huge return on investment on. The international liberal order is not something you're going to get President Trump excited about. You're not going to have a bunch of bumper stickers saying fight for the international liberal order. But if you say to him, look, do you want to be a global leader in the house you built with your friends and allies, or do you want that house to come apart at a time when you're trying to fix America in many ways, a time when you're trying to do other things? Because it's going to fall apart if you don't take these various actions. And the investment that you put into this, which you've spent so much on over the years, is going to be small compared to what's been spent on in the past. So you have to have somebody talk to the president-elect in those terms, and he is pragmatic. He listens from everything I've heard on this set of issues, and so I think you could, and I hope you'll see an evolution of 140 characters or more over time. But I'm actually relatively encouraged by the evolution that I've seen thus far. But it is a story that's being written.
Terrific.
Well, yeah.
Where in our last 2 minutes, I want to hear at least something from each sector. Jimmy, what's your takeaway from this discussion? Of course not. Just one thought that you'd take away.
My thought is that we need to concentrate on border control. I mean, this is what did Brexit. So, I mean, if we have a special task force that deals with border control, this might help.
The assertion of something. Wendell, what about over this side of the room? Or Pankaj, what's your takeaway thought?
It's not a takeaway, but I'm amazed how little we talked about Vladimir Putin and whatever is going on between him and Donald Trump. And I think that's the wild card here. I don't care what the Germanese have said during their processes before the Congress. What's his relationship with Vladimir Putin? What does he want to come of that relationship? I think that's going to tell us an awful lot about what happens in the Atlantic Alliance.
Thank you. Susan, what's your takeaway thought?
Well, I think that it's all well and good to have government officials discussing these things, but right now we have the people discussing these things in social media, and I think that Jim's comments before about the role that social media plays right now and the undermining of truth and the undermining of the media as an arbiter of truth is something very profound that we face today and is just as much a challenge to the well-being of the alliance as what government officials might be saying.
Thank you. And over, have we done? Yes. I think this lady right here could give us her takeaway. You are allowed to pass it on if you really have to.
I'm expecting you to ask me. But I think America should help Europe to succeed in the strengthening of the European project of security.
Thank you very much. Our time is up. I think what we've covered today, if I were to just take away a couple of points that I think are really important, is that there is a different European Union emerging. That's not what our panelists said, but that's how I would interpret what we're hearing. And it is a Europe that some used to call variable geometry. And that could actually bode for a Europe that cooperates better on defense and gives Europe a better, stronger role to play in the Transatlantic Alliance. The United States, the world is watching. The world is holding its breath. We can't examine the heart of Donald Trump. And it really matters. The rhetoric that comes out of Washington actually really matters because of the way that language then gets used across the world. At a time when the world desperately needs unifying forces within communities, within countries, within cooperative institutions. So, I think all of us want to see that. But I think our panelists have shown us that the Transatlantic Alliance is relevant, or at least potentially relevant today, and it's going to have to work very hard to deal with challenges that it's behind on. And that's going to take leadership on both sides of the Atlantic. Europe is going to have to help America act cooperatively. The United States is going to have to help Europe get its act together. Can I ask you all to join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion?